Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 4 running back rankings for the 2020 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about some news around the National Football League and why potentially we could see the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Tennessee Titans missing this week, a potential early bye week for the 2020 season. Then we'll talk about matchups at the running back position, which teams are giving up the most points to opposing running backs on a weekly basis thus far this season in a half PPR scoring format. That's correct. Every single one of my rankings throughout the week is for a half PPR scoring format, meaning everyone in the middle between standard and full PPR. So then after we talk about matchups at the running back position, we'll talk about, of course, my top 36 running back rankings on the week. For those of you who are looking for timestamps for a specific player, you go down in the description of the video and find that. But again, remember, rankings are always subject to change. With all of this craziness that is going on this week, there could be players that are fluctuating depending on whether or not, let's say Zach Moss, if he plays this week, then Devin Singletary might not be as valuable as he was last week, etc. There's a bunch of different, dynamic things that are changing the rankings every single day. So for those of you who are trying to stay up to date with my rankings, you can go to patreon.com/AndrewKiorkof. That is also in the description of the video, where I'm making content outside of this channel, giving you guys updated rankings, a private Discord server, asking me unlimited questions, and all that kind of information down low in the description for those of you who are interested. Outside of that, can't thank you guys enough. The incredible support. Getting us to 27,000 subscribers is another milestone that I did not expect to ever get to this season. So I really do appreciate you guys continuing to support the channel. As of right now, if you have not yet already, go and make sure you check out my waiver wire video from yesterday. A lot of information regarding some players that you may need to pick up, because the next information I'm going to talk about, consists of players potentially missing this week. And you might want to be able to at least get ahead of that and prepare. So let's talk about some news around the National Football League. At this current moment in time, the information that we're getting from the Tennessee Titans organization is that 3 of their players tested positive for COVID-19 this morning. They went in for a 6 a.m. meeting, they were tested, and they tested positive. So what exactly did that cause? That caused every single player to be sent home. Not only did players test positive, but 5 other people that work for the Tennessee Titans organization also tested positive. So at this current moment in time, the facility is currently closed until Saturday. That means that the Tennessee Titans are not going to be practicing, are not going to be preparing outside of potential Zoom calls this week. Now, just because 3 players tested positive does not mean that there's not maybe potentially more players that could test positive as the week progresses. They're going to come through with drive-through tests and try to figure all of that out. Now, that not only affects the Tennessee Titans, but the Pittsburgh Steelers. At this current moment in time, there is a very high potential that both of these teams are going to have a bye week in week 4, because there could be a lot of infected players this week, and they're not going to risk playing against the Pittsburgh Steelers and getting 2 organizations sick. Now, on top of that, the potential of both of those organizations potentially having a bye week this week, then having to resettle for another game down the road. The Minnesota Vikings just played the Tennessee Titans. There's a potential that that organization will test this today, and there could be players that over there are sick. If that's the case, then they and the Houston Texans game might be postponed potentially. Again, if there is a wide case of players that are all getting sick, then they're going to stop it. If it's one player, like let's say, for example, last week, A.J. Terrell, the cornerback, rookie cornerback of the Atlanta Falcons, he tested positive, a day before the game. He was, deemed inactive. The rest of the team played. Now, there's always a potential that if it's 10, 12 players that are going to miss, then we probably are going to get a bye week here. But if in fact we have ourselves, those 3 players and only those 3 players currently infected and or sick, they'll be sent home, and then the rest of the team could potentially play. I'm hearing rumors that they might push it to Monday night, but you should go ahead and begin to prepare for the possibility that the Tennessee Titans and or the Pittsburgh Steelers are most likely not going to play this week. That is a reality, and I just want everybody to be prepared for it. If you were, planning on playing Big Ben or, Ryan Tannehill, Derrick Henry, James Conner, Juju Smith-Schuster, Jonnu Smith, you need to go ahead and find an alternative this week, and that's why the waiver wire is so important. So again, that's the biggest news as of going into this week. It is a bomb that has been dropped on the National Football League, and depending on how the NFL is going to respond to this is really going to define the rest of the season. So it's interesting to see exactly what they're going to do, the different precautionary measures that are going to take place, and exactly what kind of execution we're going to see from both these organizations this week in terms of keeping their players and their workers safe going forward. So this is going to be a very pivotal moment in this upcoming season, and I'm hoping everything goes well and everybody stays healthy. But again, it's going to be very tricky for us as fantasy football players to be able to determine if in fact if they're going to play on Sunday, if it's going to be moved to Monday. Do we rather just play somebody else and not risk the potential of having a 0 in our lineup because, they don't end up playing this week? We'll talk about that as the week progresses. Regardless, I want to also talk about running back matchups going into week 4. Now that we've kind of gone over the doom and gloom of the potential week 4 bipocalypse that might occur this week, now let's talk about some running back matchups going into week 4. Let's talk about the players that we are going to really be expecting to pop off this week based on their current matchups. The graphic that you can see on screen right now shows how many points defenses are giving up to opposing running backs on a weekly basis thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format. As of right now, the Las Vegas Raiders are giving up the most points to opposing running backs, which really shouldn't be a surprise considering the fact that Rex Burkhead had an incredible game against them just this past Sunday. Now, also the Carolina Panthers, who have been in this conversation of giving up too many points to opposing running backs, got torched by Austin Ekeler. Austin Ekeler almost had himself another touchdown at the end of the game. If that hook and ladder ended up executing properly, unfortunately did not. Outside of them, the Green Bay Packers, of course, they had to roll up against Alvin Kamara, who torched them this past week, had himself an incredible game as the number 1 wide receiver per se of that team. But again, these are the teams that are giving up the most points to opposing running backs this week. Again, Dalvin Cook should be in a great matchup. James Robinson in a great matchup. Melvin Gordon. Kenyan Drake could potentially have himself a pretty good week here, especially against Carolina Panthers. There's a lot of juicy matchups on hand this week, and hopefully players that haven't been able to had their breakout game in 2020 can have it this upcoming week. Now, in terms of what teams are giving up the fewest amount of points to opposing running backs thus far this season, the San Francisco 49ers shouldn't really be a surprise. They gave up literally no points to Dion Lewis, Wayne Gallman, and Devontae Freeman. That backfield was not able to accomplish anything. Of course, the Pittsburgh Steelers, who might even miss this week, they're going to be playing against the Tennessee Titans. If Derrick Henry is going up against this matchup, could be very difficult for him. The Los Angeles Chargers, even though Mike Davis had an incredible game, they've typically been pretty stout defensively and able to stop opposing running backs. The Baltimore Ravens, of course, even with Clyde Edwards-Helaire having himself a pretty good game. They've been pretty stout defensively and not really giving up too many points. It hasn't been the greatest matchup against these teams thus far this season. But again, kind of gives you some context as to how many points and how good of a matchup potential running backs are going to be in this upcoming week. Now that we've covered that, we can go ahead and we could talk about my top 36 running back rankings. Again, rankings are subject to change. I'm going to be including players from the Tennessee Titans and the Pittsburgh Steelers in my rankings because I'm hoping they're going to play. So to kind of give you some context, they will be included on today's episode. So let's go ahead and without further ado, talk about my number 1 running back on the week. The guy who was the number 1 running back last week, didn't have to change the graphic, left him exactly where he would put, because Alvin Kamara was unstoppable this past week against the Green Bay Packers. And this upcoming week against Detroit Lions, it's not going to be any different. I mean, it really is not going to be any different. Alvin Kamara last week only ran the ball 6 times for 58 yards and did majority of his damage through the air as the number 1 receiving option of that team, especially with, with Michael Thomas gone. Alvin Kamara has really turned into a different tier of running back. He had 14 targets leading to 13 receptions, 139 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns, a total of 38.2 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. If you have Alvin Kamara on your team and you lost this week, it just seems like that's not even a part of the formula. Alvin Kamara is leading to wins, and as of right now, the number 1 running back in the National Football League really cannot be stopped, whether it's on the ground or through the air. He's dominating, and I think the Detroit Lions are going to be in a little bit of trouble this week, as I expect Michael Thomas to miss once again and Alvin Kamara to continue to torch teams throughout the air on these little dump-off passes and after the catch. Moving on to our number 2 running back on this week, we have Dalvin Cook. He had an incredible game. 22 carries leading to 181 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown against the Tennessee Titans is no joke. 24.9 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. And this upcoming week, they take on the Houston Texans, who have been getting destroyed on the ground for the past 3 weeks. I mean, think about it. Week 1, Clyde Edwards-Helaire absolutely dominated them. In week 2, the Baltimore Ravens just did whatever they wanted on the ground. Everybody was getting a piece of them. And just this past week, James Conner went for over 100 on the ground. So I think Dalvin Cook, this offense is kind of finding themselves a little bit more as the weeks progress. Dalvin Cook's going to continue to be a monster on the ground and definitely be able to impose his will on this Houston Texans defense. He's my number 2 on the week. Moving on to our number 3 running back this week, it's Ezekiel Elliott. Now, I know many of you may have been disappointed with his performance this past week, only putting up 14.8 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format, only 14 rushing attempts leading to 34 rushing yards. Those aren't great numbers, but this was as negative of a game script they're going to face. They were getting boat raced by the Seattle Seahawks, and it was a pass-heavy game script in the second half. That being said, the exciting part of that is the fact that Ezekiel Elliott had a total of 12 targets. Now, he only caught 6 of those total 12 targets, but as the weeks progress, the more and more he is getting involved in the passing game, the better for his overall fantasy, stock and potential production as the weeks progress in a half or full PPR scoring format. So that is an exciting thing to see. Again, we've seen Ezekiel Elliott catch the ball 77 times in the season before, back in 2018. He's definitely capable of doing it. I know there's a lot of weapons in this offense. He probably won't get up there, but the more he gets work in the passing game, the more he is going to have at least more stable, productive weeks, and he's not going to disappear as much. 15 points isn't really disappearing, but you usually expect 22 plus from Zeke, especially in a high-scoring matchup as such. Regardless, he's going to have himself a pretty good week against the Cleveland defense, and I expect him to be a pretty good running back, my top 3. Moving on, we have Aaron Jones as my number 4. Aaron Jones has been incredibly consistent thus far this season. Just this past week in a tough matchup, 16 carries for 69 yards and a touchdown. Still got some work in the passing game, nothing too exciting, but this week they take on the Atlanta Falcons. They really can't stop a soul. The Atlanta Falcons are giving up too many points, and especially a lot of points in the second half. If in fact the Green Bay Packers have themselves a pretty big lead in the first half, they're just going to be running the ball heavily with Aaron Jones in the second half. I expect them to get ahead early, run the ball, and give themselves a pretty good advantage, especially with the fact that Devontae Adams is out. It looks like the red zone seems to have Aaron Jones' name printed all over it. So as of right now, has himself another great matchup as my number 4 this week. Our next running back on hand is my number 5, Josh Jacobs. Now, Josh Jacobs has been disappointing for the last couple of weeks, mainly because he's been in a pretty tough matchup in the past 2 weeks. Playing against the New Orleans Saints, not an easy matchup. Playing against the New England Patriots, not an easy matchup. But majority of the reasons why he has been struggling is the fact that touchdowns have been siphoned away from him. Going against the New Orleans Saints, we have ourselves Jalen Richard stealing a touchdown. We have ourselves the fullback catching a touchdown, or Darren Waller catching a 1-yard touchdown. These are things that are going to hurt the overall productivity and or consistency of a Josh Jacobs player. But just this past week, we saw similar things in which this offense was really stalling because they really couldn't pass the ball. And obviously the New England Patriots were able to stop the run. But again, Josh Jacobs, 16 carries for 71 yards, still had a pretty productive game, is continuously catching the ball more than a lot of other running backs. At this current moment in time, he's 12th in targets at the running back position. He's getting more and more receptions as the weeks progress. That's going to continue to give him more consistency, but we need touchdown consistency from a guy like Josh Jacobs, especially in an offense that runs the ball so much. He needs to see more work on the goal line, get more opportunity. I think he'll be able to do that this week. Again, if we look at what the Rams just did against the Buffalo Bills, as of right now, I think Buffalo has a lot of weaknesses defensively, especially on the ground. I mean, Darrell Henderson went for over 100 on the ground. I think Josh Jacobs is definitely capable of doing so, and I think he will do that this week. He's my number 5. We move on to number 6. James Conner. So as of right now, James Conner is in a very, interesting situation. He might not play this week, but if he does play, he's coming off of 2 back-to-back 100-yard rushing games and a rushing touchdown each of the last 2 weeks. Just this past week, had 5 targets leading the 5 targets leading the 4 receptions and 40 receiving yards. James Conner is as advertised. When he's healthy, James Conner is a 20-point monster every single week. That has been 100% proven over the last 2 seasons prior to this. So as of right now, playing against Tennessee, they just gave up 181 yards on the ground to Dalvin Cook. The week prior, they gave up 100 yards on the ground to James Robinson. The week prior to that, Melvin Gordon had himself a pretty good game against them, having over 15 fantasy points. So again, there's always a possibility that if in fact they play, James Conner is going to torch that defense, to say the very least. That is why he's a top 6 running back. A lot of people don't really think that highly of James Conner, but just go look at the numbers. They don't lie. He's been putting up 20 fantasy points plus each of the last 2 weeks. He has a very good matchup on hand this week. Should be great. Moving on. We have ourselves Jonathan Taylor at number 7. Now, Jonathan Taylor didn't have the incredible game that we all expected him to, but it wasn't really necessary. I mean, 13 rushing attempts isn't going to lead to much, especially when your team is winning because they have 2 pick sixes and the defense is, just outright dominating. They had a lot of usage of Jordan Wilkins late in the game. So again, Jonathan Taylor, sure, he had himself his, 13 fantasy points, got his job done. All well. But this upcoming week, playing against Chicago's defense, it's going to be a tougher matchup, but I think they're going to ask upon him a lot more than we saw in the past. Hopefully, he'll get more utilization in the passing game and on the ground. Just looking at what the Atlanta Falcons were able to do on the ground against Chicago, it's pretty glaring. I mean, Todd Gurley had a great game. Brian Hill had a great game. Both of them, not the greatest running backs in the world as of this moment in time, and not behind a great offensive line in terms of running the ball. This is a pass-heavy offense, but was able to actively run the ball and find a lot of consistency there. When we talk about a team that wants to run the ball and is really good at doing so because of their offensive line, that's the Indianapolis Colts, and that's why I think Jonathan Taylor this week could actually really have a pop-off game. He sits at number 7. Moving on to Mr. King Henry. Derrick Henry is at number 8. Now, Derrick Henry at least scored some touchdowns last week, right? Over 100 yards, scored 2 touchdowns on the ground. Had himself an incredible week in terms of fantasy and overall productivity. 26 fantasy points and a half PPR scoring format. Had himself 2 receptions. He just continues to add on top of the already great performance with some more sprinkles of points here and there. But this upcoming week, you play against Pittsburgh. They're giving up little to nothing on the ground. Can Derrick Henry and this offensive line impose their will this upcoming week? If in fact they do play, I'm still starting Derrick Henry because I do believe that whether or not he's going to be productive, he's always going to be the goal line back. He's always going to, at least in the second half, be able to wear down defenses. And what we've seen thus far this season, there hasn't really been a defense that can stop everything. There are sometimes you'll see the Pittsburgh Steelers be able to stop the run, but then they'll just start giving up passes. Deshaun Watson was able to really get after them this past week and almost force them into an overtime situation. But regardless, I think Derrick Henry is still a relevant prospect this week and should have himself a pretty good week here. We move on to Nick Chubb as my number 9. They play against the Dallas Cowboys, and the thing is, Nick Chubb is really starting to pick up momentum. This past week, 20 total touches, had over 100 yards on the ground, had himself 2 rushing touchdowns. That's back-to-back weeks of 2 total touchdowns. Playing against Dallas shouldn't be too difficult of a matchup in terms of their ability to stop the run. I know they did pretty well against Chris Carson relatively, but they didn't really have to use Chris Carson. So I think Chris Carson really could have had over 100 yards on that game. He got injured, unfortunately, but again, I think as of right now, it's going to be game script heavy. If Nick Chubb and this team is going to be able to easily run the ball, then they're just going to plow with Nick Chubb and be perfectly fine. But if in fact they go down early, then you'll see more utilization of Kareem Hunt, and that's going to hurt Nick Chubb. It's all game script based with this team. So if they're winning, and Nick Chubb's going to be riding high. But if they're losing, then we're going to see a little bit less in Nick Chubb, less opportunities, less fantasy points, etc. So we're just going to have to wait and see. But as of right now, I expect Nick Chubb to be a pretty good running back this week. I don't think the game script will get too out of hand for them. Moving on to our number 10, Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Clyde Edwards had a great game last night. I mean, again, the fact that he caught 5 passes for 70 yards is just going to continue to build for him. Again, let's not forget, he is a receiving back at LSU. That's exactly why they brought him in, because he is so capable through the air. On the ground, still had 20 touches, only led to 64 yards. Again, they're playing against Baltimore's defense. It wasn't expected for him to have incredible gains on the ground, but he got the job done. That being said, putting up 15.9 fantasy points against the Baltimore Ravens, a pretty good performance, especially without a touchdown. Play against New England this week, has a very high likelihood of being able to score. I think, again, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, another one of these top 12 backs on a consistent basis, putting up some great points. If he scores a touchdown, he gets himself into that top 5 conversation. But again, nothing is guaranteed on the ground in terms of touchdowns and red zone opportunities, especially when you're passing the ball to Eric Fisher on the 1-yard line. Really does everybody a favor. Moving on, we have ourselves Kenyan Drake. Now, I know Kenyan Drake has been hurting fantasy owners pretty heavily. He's putting up, 8 fantasy points per week and a half, PPR scoring format. Just this past week, 8.4. But he is amongst the top running backs in terms of total touches thus far this season. He's getting upwards of 17 rushing attempts per game thus far this season. And that kind of average is going to continue to build. Though he's not getting the touchdowns to accompany his 8 already fantasy points to turn him into a 15-point running back every single week, the fact of the matter is that's mainly been because of Kyler Murray's rushing ability in the red zone. This upcoming week when they play against the Carolina Panthers, I think they're going to be able to rush the ball heavily. I think they'll be able to at least give Kenyan Drake more opportunity down there, and he's going to be able to score. Again, everybody's been able to score against the Carolina Panthers on the ground. I expect Kenyan Drake to finally show up this week, have himself a great performance. Again, if you can, buy low right now so that potentially you can sell high this following week and see what you can do with Kenyan Drake going forward. All right, we have ourselves number 12, James Robinson. Now, as of right now, again, James Robinson had himself a pretty good week this last week. 2 rushing touchdowns. The week prior had over 100 yards on the ground against the Tennessee Titans. But the thing that really I didn't expect to see from James Robinson was that he really was used as the Leonard Fournette of the Jacksonville Jaguars offense against Miami this past Thursday. Now, what I mean by that is that Leonard Fournette last season had a total of 70 total receptions. That in itself could be a potential pace for James Robinson. Again, the fact of the matter is that Chris Thompson's still in that organization. He's going to catch himself 4, maybe 5 passes a game with all those checkdowns that Gardner Minshew is sending out. But if a guy like James Robinson is going to catch the ball 6 times in a game, those are going to continue to rack up. He had 83 receiving yards on top of those 6 receptions. So again, those numbers are going to continue to rack up. He had 27.9 fantasy points last week. Plays against the Cincinnati Bengals. Let's go back a couple weeks to Cleveland. You saw with Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb did it, against that defense. So again, it's a pretty easy matchup. I know Miles Sanders struggled a little bit here and there, but he himself had over 100 yards on the ground against them. Didn't score a touchdown, but I think James Robinson is a tank. He should be able to run through them, and he's a top 12 back this week. Jumped a whole 6 spots this past week with that incredible performance and a great matchup this week. Austin Ekeler is my number 13, and I talked about Austin Ekeler a little bit earlier. The fact that he almost had that hook and ladder that scored a touchdown for him to win the game this past week against Carolina Panthers. Unfortunately, was not able to grab that and end himself into the end zone. But Austin Ekeler is finally back. He's really kind of asserted himself as the RB1 of this team with his utilization this past week. I mean, sure, he only had 12 touches on the ground, but he had 11 targets leading to 11 receptions and 84 receiving yards. Justin Herbert has finally unlocked the potential of Austin Ekeler, and here on forth, we're going to potentially see Austin Ekeler get 5-6 plus total catches per game, and that in itself, as one of the leading receivers of this team, right behind Keenan Allen and before Hunter Henry, Austin Ekeler's utilization in the passing game for this team was paramount last season. I mean, it was one of the most valuable things for that Chargers offense. They're going back to the well. They're going to feed Austin Ekeler the ball out of the backfield. When you play against Tampa Bay, that's where you got to hurt them. You got to hurt them in the passing game because on the ground they've been fantastic. So again, we'll see less of Josh Kelly because there's going to be a lot less efficiency in terms of running the ball, and we'll see a lot more, Austin Ekeler in the passing game. Should lead to some success thus far this season. We've seen, a lot of running backs. Specifically, we've seen Alvin Kamara and Christian McCaffrey / Mike Davis dominate them in the passing game. So again, Austin Ekeler will be able to take advantage of that and have himself a pretty good week here. We move on. We have ourselves Darrell Henderson as my number 14 running back. Again, had himself in a fantastic game. When you go ahead and you run for 114 rushing yards on 20 carries, have yourself a rushing touchdown. On top of the fact that the week prior had himself 70 plus rushing yards and a rushing touchdown against the Philadelphia Eagles. With Cam Akers hurt, Malcolm Brown looking like he's being fizzled out of this offensive scheme, Darrell Henderson, as of right now, is the starting running back of this team. You play against the New York Giants. Easy matchup to say the very least. It seems like an automatic W for Darrell Henderson this upcoming week. And as the weeks progress, if Cam Akers is not coming back and Darrell Henderson proceeds to continue to win this starting job, they're going to ride with the hot hand. And as it currently stands, even with Darrell Henderson splitting 50% of his offensive snaps with Malcolm Brown only had 7 rushing attempts. They're splitting snaps 50-50. But Darrell Henderson is getting the rushing work. That is exactly what we want to see. And hopefully he'll continue to do so against the New York Giants, who is a terrible defense and a terrible team as a whole right now. Hopefully they can turn it around as an organization, but it looks like it's not going to be the case. Moving around. We have ourselves a number 15, Joe Mixon. Now, I know Joe Mixon was low on my list last week, and a lot of you were questioning why he was so low. You got to remember, guys, this is not a good blocking team as of right now. Their offensive line is not firing on all cylinders. The quarterback play is not the greatest, though he's scoring fantasy points. And to be honest, Joe Mixon isn't getting enough touches throughout games, and especially in negative game scripts. Playing against the Philadelphia Eagles was not going to be a fun task, especially against that front seven. So I avoided him last week. This upcoming week, you play against the Jacksonville Jaguars. In my opinion, it's a very easy matchup. I think Myles Gaskin was able to get himself some pretty good production last week, even with being force-fed total carries. Now, as of right now, I think Joe Mixon should get more utilization in the passing game as he has been, sprinkled here and there. But hopefully this week, against a very easy matchup in my eyes, Joe Mixon is going to be able to deliver. Again, we've had to wait a couple weeks for him to at least do something and kind of give us a spark. Hopefully we'll find that again. It's mainly going to be whether or not he gets that touchdown. I think they'll finally have that this week. Should be a pretty good matchup for the Cincinnati Bengals against the defense that really isn't able to stop much, especially against Ryan Fitzpatrick of all teams. But regardless, we go ahead and move on to our number 16 here. Chris Carson. Chris Carson dealing with a knee sprain. If he misses this week, again, rankings are subject to change. We'll move Carlos Hyde into a top 30 situation, and we'll move Chris Carson out. But if he does play, if he's healthy, he practices the full week at a full participation rate, then I'm good to go with him playing against the Miami Dolphins. Again, he hasn't been able to capture a rushing touchdown this season, but he's still on pace. Has 3 touchdowns in the first 3 weeks of the season. Should be great to go as we continue. But again, if he's healthy and ready to go, I'm still going to play him against Miami. I think he's in a pretty good spot as of this week. But again, it's just a matter of whether or not he is going to be able to play and be healthy. So if he's good to go, I'm firing him up. He's been one of the better running backs in the National Football League over the last couple of weeks. Again, 14 carries for 64 yards last week. Still had himself 3 catches on 3 targets, 12 yards. He's going to continue to get more utilization. They didn't really have to use him last week because, again, it was more of a, hey, we need to throw the ball heavily. This coming week, if in fact they blow out this team, then Chris Carson will get a little bit more touches here and there against the Miami Dolphins. Moving on, we have ourselves number 17, Mike Davis. Now, speaking of, Seattle Seahawks running backs, or a former Seattle Seahawks running back, Mike Davis, I was 100% wrong. I will admit that first and foremost. Mike Davis proved me wrong last week. I thought to myself, well, Christian McCaffrey didn't get too many touches in the passing game the first couple of weeks. Why would Mike Davis, of all running backs, start getting more work in the passing game? I have no clue. But it seems to me that Mike Davis, having back-to-back weeks of 8+ receptions, is going to be the real deal until Christian McCaffrey returns. It's absolutely ridiculous that on the ground, sure, he disappeared. 13 touches for 46 yards, not a big deal. But 9 targets leading to 8 receptions, 45 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Those are incredible numbers. If he's going to continue to see 8+ catches in the passing game, half PPR, full PPR, regardless, he's going to be such a valuable prospect and a 3-down back to say the very least. So again, I was definitely wrong on the potential of him and the utilization of him. And going forward, Mike Davis looks like he's the real deal for the Carolina Panthers offense, especially in an offense that needs to be able to pass the ball because they haven't been able to effectively run the ball with Mike Davis in the last 2 weeks. So we move on. We find ourselves Melvin Gordon at number 18. Melvin Gordon's in a very advantageous position this week. They play against the New York Jets defense on Thursday Night Football. Again, the Denver Broncos will have a backup quarterback that's not Blake Bortles and or Jeff Driscoll, which is interesting. But regardless, I think still the whole point of this offense this Thursday night is going to be run the ball. Philip Lindsay's still a little bit questionable whether he plays or not on a short week. Royce Freeman is the backup, but those guys aren't really impeding the potential of Melvin Gordon. He's going to be able to run wild on this Jets defense, and I think he'll be able to deliver for fantasy owners. Again, this is a guy that can get it through, can get it done through the air or on the ground. Regardless, he's going to be the goal line back this upcoming week. And against a team that really has been struggling, I think Denver can really show up defensively, give themselves more opportunities on offense, and get Melvin Gordon in the end zone, potentially multiple times this upcoming week. Regardless, should get, himself his usual amount of touches. This past week was a little different because Tampa Bay's defense is so great, but typically Melvin Gordon's averaging about 20 touches a game. Against the Jets, that's automatic success. We move on. We find ourselves Kareem Hunt as number 19. Again, Kareem Hunt's potential is going to be based on the game script. If in fact the Dallas Cowboys this week are going to force Kareem Hunt into the matchup more, than sure, they're going to get him, they're going to get him some targets here and there. He's going to get utilized. I mean, they're setting up plays in the red zone for Kareem Hunt in the passing game. We've seen that over the last couple of weeks. He's catching multiple touchdowns. Just this past week, had himself 16 rushing attempts, regardless of the fact that Nick Chubb had himself 19 rushing attempts. So again, both these running backs being used heavily. This is a run-first scheme. Both these running backs are very talented, and I think going forward, as long as Kareem Hunt's scoring touchdowns, he's going to be an extremely relevant part of this offense and a relevant fantasy back going forward. Devin Singletary specifically is my number 20. I think with the matchup against the Las Vegas Raiders, it should be free pickings. It should be an easy play. He should have over 100 rushing yards, should have 50 receiving yards on 5 catches. Should be automatic. But the fact that Devin Singletary doesn't score touchdowns because of Josh Allen has really diminished his overall value. And I think going forward, it's a little bit harder to trust him as an automatic play. Regardless, a top 20 back is typically just an automatic play going forward. Now, as of right now, I'm just worried about the potential of him not scoring a touchdown. If he doesn't do that, he doesn't get, jumped into this upper echelon of players who are getting more work in terms of the passing game and or the goal line touches that are giving them that extra 6-point boost. So again, Devin Singletary in a fantastic matchup, especially if Zach Moss misses again, should be a great play, but it's just a matter of whether or not he scores touchdowns and whether he can get to that, upper level of fantasy value. Moving on to David Montgomery. With Tariq Cohen having torn his ACL, David Montgomery is going to be the receiving back of the team going forward. With a guy like Nick Foles at quarterback, that's going to continue to lead to a lot of receptions going forward, a lot of checkdowns. Hopefully this week against the Indianapolis Colts, that the Chicago Bears come out, want to punch them in the mouth, kind of give them a little bit of their own taste of their own medicine, run the ball heavily. I think David Montgomery as a 3-down back going forward is an extremely valuable prospect. I think he's gained a lot of value. We're just going to have to see what kind of opportunity he gets in the passing game, and if they maybe want to bring in another player to play that 3rd-down role. Hopefully they don't. Hopefully they give it to Montgomery, but we'll see how it progresses as we go out throughout the weeks. Moving on to our number 22, we have ourselves Todd Gurley. had himself a pretty good game this past week, to say the very least. Todd Gurley was fantastic, but the question remains whether or not Todd Gurley can do this on a weekly basis. Can he be this consistent? Having himself 14 rushes for 80 rushing yards and a touchdown is great. 14.7 fantasy points and a half PPR, beautiful, we love it. But you play against the Green Bay Packers. Your offense has been struggling. Sure, you can mount early leads, you can run the ball late, but against the Green Bay Packers, a defense that is probably going to play them pretty square, probably not going to give them much on the ground, will probably allow them to throw the ball as much as they want. But with Todd Gurley's inability to get any work in the passing game, the fact that he was splitting touches here and there with Brian Hill kind of lowers his overall value. But on top of that, they're probably going to be blown out relatively early. It's going to force Matt Ryan to have to pass the ball way more in the second half. And if that's the case, Todd Gurley could be disappearing a lot faster than we would expect. Again, Todd Gurley's been on this pace of, sure, he's getting touches, he's getting yards, but the touchdowns really becoming the dependent part of his overall production. If he's relevant, it's because he scored a touchdown, nothing less, nothing more, because of his absence in the passing game. Moving on to our number 23, we have ourselves David Johnson. Now, I know David Johnson's been quite disappointing in the past couple weeks, but it's mainly because he's played against Baltimore and Pittsburgh. Now that we've gotten past those two terrible matchups for him, it's smooth sailing. The matchups are going to be far easier. Playing against Minnesota should be easy. Against Derrick Henry went for over 100, 2 touchdowns the week prior. Jonathan Taylor had himself a great game. So again, the potential is going to be there for David Johnson. Touches are going to be there. Goal line carries. The receiving game, that's all going to continue to snowball. As the weeks progress and as he gets more momentum, a little bit of a hot hand, I think David Johnson will be asked to do more in this offense. But again, as of right now, a top 23 prospect to say the very least in this matchup against the Minnesota Vikings should be a fun one for David Johnson to be able to at least rip off a couple big runs here and there and have himself a pretty good defining game here against Minnesota and get himself back on track for the season. We move on to our 24 running back, and the last of the top 24, Miles Sanders. Miles Sanders has dropped a little bit this week. Why? Because he plays against the San Francisco 49ers, and the Eagles' offense looks terrible. I mean, they could not do anything correctly this past Sunday against the Cincinnati Bengals. The Cincinnati Bengals are not a great defense. They're not a great team overall, but with the amount of mistakes they've made in the passing game, the injuries that they've sustained offensive line-wise, receiver-wise, and the poor performances of specifically Carson Wentz, this offense has not looked great at all. And going forward, I can't really trust their offense to consistently give me great performances. Now, I trust Miles Sanders. That is for certain. The fact that he had himself 22 total touches, 8 targets last week. That in itself, 8 targets, beautiful number. But if you're going to play against the Cincinnati Bengals and only put up 12.7 fantasy points, what are you going to do against the San Francisco 49ers? That's my concern. So as of right now, I'm a little worried about Miles Sanders. He's a little bit in this Joe Mixon situation where the offense is not functioning properly. And sure, he may be getting carries, but it's a really tough matchup this week. He drops to number 24. Not really too sure about what we're going to see out of that offense this upcoming week and or going forward. Number 25 is Jerick McKinnon. I don't know if Raheem Mostert is going to play. If he does, again, rankings are subject to change, so we'll go ahead and adjust it accordingly. But as of right now, what I'm thinking is that Jerick McKinnon is probably going to be the starter in tandem with Jeff Wilson as they give Raheem Mostert another week off. Regardless, Jerick McKinnon has been great. Had himself a rushing touchdown this past week. Had himself a receiving touchdown last week, but was called back due to a penalty. Got himself some work in the passing game. 3 receptions for 39 yards, 14 carries on the ground. Sure, it didn't leave to many rushing yards, only 38 on the ground, but the opportunity is all we want because as the weeks progress, he'll get more and more opportunity, get a little bit of that dust off of him, a little bit of that rust off of him. He'll continue to make some plays for this offense that is in desperate need of a starting running back to consistently make plays again with the injuries that they've taken over the last 2 weeks with Raheem Mostert and Tevin Coleman. McKinnon's really stepping up into this RB1 role for the team. So he's my number 25. Moving on to our number 26 is Mark Ingram. The Ravens offense was horrible last night. I would, be the first one to admit it. I mean, it was hard to watch. The running game, though it was there, could not be executed upon because the passing game was not there. Majority of this offense is predicated on running the ball and then being able to hit them with play action. They could not do that. Lamar Jackson had less than 100 passing yards. It was a complete meltdown for that offense, and it definitely affected their running backs. Again, if they're going to continue to rotate running backs, it's going to continue to hurt Mark Ingram, regardless of playing against the Washington football team this week and that being a relatively easy matchup and the potential of the Ravens having a little bit of a revenge game this week, considering they got embarrassed on Monday night. I still think that Mark Ingram should be in a good spot to at least be the starter and potentially score, but I don't put too much faith into that as of right now. So we leave him at 26. Moving on to number 27, Rex Burkhead. As of right now, playing against KC, not an easy prospect, but from what we saw from majority of the teams that have played against them this year, they're very susceptible of giving up yards on the ground. That's exactly what the Patriots are doing right now. They ran for over 250 yards on the ground against the Las Vegas Raiders. They want to continue to impose their will on the ground, whether it's with Sony Michel or Rex Burkhead. I think Burkhead, with his opportunities in the passing game, going to continue to strive for greatness and potentially have himself a little bit of that James White-esque role in this offense going forward. If in fact James White misses again this week, again, Rex Burkhead is a guy that you want to grab, fire up this week in a pretty advantageous matchup, in my opinion, against KC. We have ourselves Myles Gaskin at number 28. Again, Myles Gaskin last week had 27 total touches, plays against the Seattle Seahawks. Myles Gaskin's biggest contributions are always going to be in the passing game. So if you play in a half PPR or full PPR scoring format, he is going to have value there. On the ground, sure, he's never going to score touchdowns. Maybe he can break out a run, but I think this is going to be mainly a negative game script. A lot of passing from Ryan Fitzpatrick in the second half. That means a lot of opportunity for Myles Gaskin in the passing game to be able to rack up receiving yards and receptions going forward. Number 29 is Antonio Gibson. Back-to-back weeks of scoring a touchdown. Back-to-back weeks of being the lead back of this team. Now, as it currently stands, you play against Baltimore, probably going to get blown out. What does that mean? Dwayne Haskins is going to have to pass a lot. If, in fact, he has to pass a lot against Marcus Peters and Marlon Humphreys and, Jimmy Smith, you're going to throw some picks. So where is that going to lead you? Either to the tight end position or to the backfield. Hopefully, Antonio Gibson gets more work in the passing game. Hopefully, they really let him kind of run loose in this backfield, get him more involved. And I think if, in fact, they can get him 15-plus touches a game, can consistently jump into this top 24 conversation, especially with the upside of a touchdown in the last couple of weeks. We move on to our last of the top 30 backs. We have Jeff Wilson. Now, again, Jeff Wilson in tandem with Jerick McKinnon is going to continue to find value. He scored himself 2 touchdowns this past week, got himself 3 receptions for 54 receiving yards, had 12 touches on the ground. Him and McKinnon practically had same games. The only difference was that Jeff Wilson scored an extra touchdown, which gave him a better overall contribution to the team. So if, in fact, Jeff Wilson's going to be the starting back going forward, then sure, he could be a little bit higher ranked. But I think as of right now, 2 touchdowns, that's a little bit out of control. I don't know if he's going to get that once again this week, especially against Philadelphia, but we're just going to have to wait and see. Either way, has himself a lot of potential value this week in the matchup. Regardless, we move on to Nyheim Hines is my number 31. I think Chicago versus Indianapolis is going to be a little bit of a different kind of game script for Indianapolis. They've been just blowing out teams against Minnesota and the Jets the past 2 weeks, so they've been running the ball a lot in the second half. I wonder what Nick Foles is going to bring to the table. If, in fact, they kind of push the Indianapolis Colts to the limit, could we see more utilization of Nyheim Hines as the week progresses, get more receptions, maybe a touchdown? Again, he had a goal line touch last week that almost led to a rushing touchdown. So, again, Nyheim Hines getting some touches here and there could lead to some success in his overall production. Moving on, Sony Michel. Again, Sony Michel is always used when the New England Patriots play against the Kansas City Chiefs. When I say he's always used, I mean they always want to hand him the ball 10, 15, 20 times when they play against KC because they know KC struggles against the run. So the amount of contributions that he had against the Las Vegas Raiders last week, he sneakily had 9 carries for over 100 yards. If Sony Michel this week shows up, has himself 10, 15 carries for a good amount of yardage, has himself a rushing touchdown, I'm not going to be surprised at all. Again, they wanted to warm him up a little bit as he has the current hot hand. I'm not really worried about Damian Harris coming out of nowhere and stealing a job. That's going to be a matter of a couple of weeks or an injury occurring. But as of right now, Sony Michel, not a bad option in week 4 as my number 32 running back. Number 33 is Malcolm Brown. We talked about him earlier in relation to Darrell Henderson. Darrell Henderson, the starting back. But if, in fact, they blow out the New York Giants, which I expect them to do so, second half, fourth quarter, run the ball with Malcolm Brown, kill the clock, and get rid of it. Even with that being said, I think Malcolm Brown could have a pretty good game on the ground if, in fact, he's given those kind of opportunities. If he gets 10-plus touches on the ground, 15 touches because they're killing clock, Malcolm Brown could have himself a pretty good week here because that defense is not really able to stop too many players going forward. Number 34 is Ronald Jones. Ronald Jones, as of right now in a half PPR, 8, 9, 10 points in fantasy. Really, we haven't seen the transition to Leonard Fournette, even though we thought after week 2 there's a potential that they could just transition to Fournette. Ronald Jones still has a job currently. I'm not too happy about it. I'm not excited about the fact that I have Ronald Jones on today's list and not Leonard Fournette here. But we're just going to have to wait and see because this backfield is just It's confusing. I don't know what to expect. I don't know what their head coach is thinking. Bruce Arians is making a mistake, in my opinion, giving Ronald Jones so many opportunities. Maybe they're just waiting, keeping Leonard Fournette fresh. I don't know what the deal is, but regardless, it's really making me have a headache in terms of fantasy production. The LA Chargers are pretty good against the run regardless, so we're just going to have to wait and see what we're going to see out of this offense going forward. Number 35, we have Adrian Peterson playing against New Orleans. Pretty tough matchup, but typically Adrian Peterson, regardless of matchup, is just running through teams. He's an absolute tank. He is the Terminator, and nothing's really going to stop him from having his judgment day. So as of right now, Adrian Peterson just going to continue to fall forward, gain yards. DeAndre Swift, Kerryon Johnson, really an afterthought in his backfield as we see Adrian Peterson continuing to carry the ball 20-plus times and feast out of this backfield. So he'll sit at number 35 with his opportunity production. 36 there was a lot of names that I thought about, but I have the idea that Chase Edmonds could be a pretty good play this week. With Kenyan Drake probably have himself a pretty easy game against Carolina. We could see Chase Edmonds score. There's been a lot of weeks. The past 2 weeks, Chase Edmonds has been overthrown on passes that could have led to touchdowns. So again, Kyler Murray, clean it up a little bit, stop throwing picks, and let's get ourselves Chase Edmonds a little bit more relevant in this, in this week, potentially get him some more value and or opportunity. Regardless, these are my top 36 running back rankings going to week 4. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure you smash that like button. Make sure you subscribe to the channel for those of you who are looking for 2020 fantasy football content for the entirety of the year. We do this every single week, so I do appreciate you guys coming by, watching the channel. Again, please hit that like button. It really does make a difference. Try to get us over 1,000 would be a fantastic accomplishment today. Regardless, this is pretty much it. Top 36 running backs. Hopefully, we don't get any games canceled this week. Hopefully, everybody's staying healthy and ready to go. Because again, if in fact we're going to be missing a guy like Derrick Henry or James Conner, then we're going to have to scramble, find some other players on waivers, throw them in there, especially if you're hurting at running back because of all the injuries that have taken place thus far this season. It's not just running backs that we have to worry about missing. It's quarterbacks, it's wide receivers, it's tight ends. But either way, hopefully everything goes well. We'll keep you updated as the weeks progress. But as of right now, this is it. Thank you everybody for watching. Until tomorrow when we talk about wide receivers, my top 36 at the position. I appreciate you guys, and I'll see you guys later. Peace.